Hi, everyone. My name is Michael. I am a now Yale graduate. I was a Hemispheres teacher for 4 years, so many of you might know me as a familiar face. Um, I wanted to return to Hemispheres as part of the summer series, where we'll be discussing policing in the pandemic. Um, in particular, I'll be discussing the COVID-19 vaccine, which I find is a place for pragmatic optimism. I remember discussing the coronavirus with many of you back in February, post cancellation of Wyman, which I was a part of. And I remember a lot of us did not suspect the pandemic would, first, that the coronavirus situation would become a pandemic, and second, that it would unravel the way it has, with many more infections than we could have possibly imagined. And so I don't think any of us imagined how the situation would worsen over the span of weeks, really. Um, but I did want to talk about the light at the end of the tunnel, which I think is something that gives me some room for hope. Of course, I don't want to get anyone's hopes up too much, but I do want to give you guys some room for what I'm calling pragmatic optimism, because I think that's important, to know that there are efforts going into stopping it, and to putting an end to the pandemic. So the goal is a coronavirus vaccine. So this vaccine would prevent future infections. So if your immune system has if you've been vaccinated, your immune system is prepared for should you ever come in contact with the coronavirus, that you won't be infected, and if you are infected, then it won't necessarily be transmitted to others because they'll also have immunity. So the goal really is to create some type of prevention mechanism to stop the coronavirus in its tracks. As we've seen, the coronavirus is incredibly contagious, and I get that seems like an understatement, but it's truly a terrible virus, and for many it's asymptomatic, especially with younger individuals, and it's particularly difficult for those who are part of the elderly or the vulnerable communities. So we need to be really careful about this. So the coronavirus vaccine is something that we can look forward to. The current vaccine landscape as it stands is more or less divided into these different phases. So these are different scientific phases. So there's the preclinical testing stage, there's phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and then there's the final approval. This comes from the New York Times Coronavirus Tracker, which is a great resource, and I highly recommend that you look into it. As this picture comes from July 21st, so it's a bit out of date by the time you're watching this. But as of July 21st, we currently have over 160 coronavirus vaccine candidates. So what that means is that these candidates are then going through the testing process. At the preclinical stage, it's testing on animals, especially those that have immune systems comparable to those of humans. So think monkeys. Phase 1 is testing for safety and dosage. So is this just a safe vaccine to inject into human beings? And if so, how much? Phase 2 is an expansion of that first phase, so also testing for safety and dosage, but also looking into testing on people of different backgrounds and ages. So incorporating test subjects who are children and the elderly. And at this point, hopefully we have some type of semblance of understanding of whether or not the vaccine is safe. In the third phase, that's where we're going to be testing for the immune response. So does this vaccine create the type of immunity that we want to see? Is it effective, right? It's perfectly safe to inject, the vaccines that we already have, but those are not effective against the coronavirus. So the third phase is testing, are these effective against this specific virus, right? And if so, to what extent is it effective, right? Because not all the vaccines are going to be 100% effective, right? But even if one of them is like 20%, 30%, more than 50% effective, that's huge, right? Because that means for every 1 out of 4 people, 1 out of 3, 1 out of 2 people, that come in contact with the virus, they won't be infected. So that's a big deal. And then lastly, there's the approval. I would not read into that one vaccine candidate that's been approved. That's in China. That's been approved with limited use to vaccinate the military as part of their testing. So I would not read into that. It's important to note that traditionally this vaccine process costs anywhere from $1 billion per vaccine and lasts between 12 and 18 months. We're accelerating that as much as we can. And we'll go through how people have been how companies and governments have been accelerating it. So currently, here are some of the big players in the vaccine landscape. You may have seen some of these names in the news. So there's Moderna, or Moderna, which is one of the biggest players. They're currently in the phase 3, so testing for efficacy. There's AstraZeneca and the University of Oxford collaboration vaccine that's also in the 3rd stage. They're testing for efficacy as well. CanSino Bio, which is a Chinese firm affiliated with the Chinese government. They're the one that was approved for limited use in the military, and they're also nearing the 3rd stage, if not already there. And Johnson & Johnson is another big one. Again, these are just some of the different players, and the hope is that several of them work, right? We don't only want one vaccine, we want several, if that's possible, because they might range in efficacy, and also some people might only be able to take one of the vaccines, right? Like for different biological reasons, you're like one person might not be able to use the Moderna vaccine, but then we have the J&J or Johnson & Johnson vaccine as an alternative. So it's important that we have all these different candidates. And also there's a high failure rate, which is just the unfortunate reality of how vaccines are manufactured. But that's why we have all this testing, and that's why we have so many different players in the game. So the question then becomes, how do we accelerate that vaccine development? And this is really important, right? So scientists, what they're doing are, first, they're expanding the trial size as much as is safe so that they have as many data points as they can due to the increased number of test subjects, right? They're also combining phases 1 and 2. So remember I had mentioned phases 1 and 2 are about safety and dosage, but phase 2 just considers a different audiences and how they would respond to the vaccine. They're more or less combining those phases as safely as they can because they want to accelerate the process. They don't want this vaccine to be developed within 12 to 18 months. They want it to be developed faster. They're also evaluating and sharing results faster with one another. So these different firms and the different governments are sharing what is generally considered a lot of intellectual property or information that is safeguarded, if not coveted or patented. So they're sharing their results where possible. They're also running concurrent trials. So there are several phase 3 trials right now, for example, that are going on in different countries with different audiences to see whether or not it's effective in different places too. And lastly is manufacturing while testing, and that's huge. So the idea is that once the vaccine is approved, it goes through all those stages, right? Preclinical testing, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, that once it's approved, we'll have plenty of vaccines ready on day 1. And that's a big deal. You don't usually do that, right? Firms, and when I say firms, I mean these like vaccine companies, they don't usually invest their resources in producing and manufacturing a vaccine that then doesn't work, right? But here, we're willing to make that investment because there's so much that's on the line and so many lives that will be helped in the process. So now the question becomes, so the vaccine race or the vaccine development pipeline has usually been from 12 to 18 months, as I mentioned, on average. There are different studies that suggest different things, but it's been very much shortened here. And a lot of newspapers and media outlets have cited this as a race between the United States and China, right? Because these are the two countries with the most advanced vaccine manufacturing, I would say vaccine development players, right? Because the biggest vaccine manufacturer is actually in India, but here are the biggest vaccine development players, right? So from the previous slides, we see here, for example, Moderna is American, Pfizer's American, Johnson & Johnson's American, whereas Sinovac is Chinese, CanSino Biologics is Chinese. There's another one that I didn't include, but Sinopharm is also Chinese. So some of the biggest players are in the US and China. And so there's a thought that this is a race between these two countries, and that can be dangerous, right? Because it could mean that countries are going to start vaccinating people without having gone through the proper procedures, and without necessarily having tested according to scientific protocol, right? But there is also positive here, right? Because in the same way that there was a race to the moon back in the 1960s between Russia or the Soviet Union and the United States, here we're seeing a race to the vaccine. Because once the vaccine is ready, right, then that country can use it for its own people. So the US wants to use the vaccine for the US, China would want to use the vaccine for China. But of course, we want to make sure that there are some types of international agreements in place, which we'll get into. But this is very much currently a two-player game. Although there are some pretty notable exceptions, right? Oxford they paired with AstraZeneca, which is an American company. Actually, I don't believe that's true. I think it's a European company. But Oxford and AstraZeneca are a pretty big collaborative vaccine candidate. Have a pretty big collaborative vaccine candidate currently going through phase 3, and there are other vaccines as well. But right now, it's very much a sprint between a race between China and the United States. One thing to note, though, is that China is using some types of technology that are not approved in other places, namely the United States. So they're using some vaccine candidates that, even if approved in China and approved for use in the Chinese market, would not be allowed necessarily for use in the United States or in other countries. A lot of the Chinese vaccines have not been tested in the US actually for that reason, although some of the Chinese vaccine candidates have agreements with countries such as Brazil and Canada for testing in other countries. And then we also see in the United States a huge investment on behalf of the executive branch, so on behalf of the Trump administration, into vaccine development. So that comes from Operation Warp Speed, which is an initiative to accelerate COVID-19 vaccine development not only in the United States, but abroad. So it's been working with different vaccine developers from other countries, although it has a couple of different key players that it's invested billions of dollars in to make sure that they're ready and going through the process as quickly as possible. Now, when we think about the race between China and the United States, we also want to think about how is this productive on an international level, because there are concerns of equity, right? Or another word for equity in this case could be fairness in the distribution of vaccines, right? So it's important to understand that if China is able to have a vaccine candidate ready, we don't want that just limited to China. We want it to be accessible wherever we can have it be most effective, right? Because it's not helpful if everyone is vaccinated in China, but then countries all around the world are struggling with the coronavirus still, right? We want this vaccine to get into the right hands, and that's important. And so that's why there are different international coalitions forming. There are a couple in the European Union. There are a couple already, some international agreements forming between China and other countries, partnerships between, for example, the United Kingdom and different European vaccine manufacturers, the United States and European vaccine manufacturers, and others. So there is this important concern, right? Because it's not just, the coronavirus is not limited to one country, not the US nor China, but it is a global pandemic. So we need to adjust our vaccine manufacturing capabilities accordingly. So the Coalition of Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, or CEPI, which is a huge collaborative entity between philanthropic, private, and public partnerships. They are kind of one of the key actors in coordinating all these different agreements, right? Working with these countries' governments and their leaders, as well as private businesses and these vaccine conglomerates, in ensuring that we have the adequate number of doses for distribution when the time comes, when these vaccines are ready. And so a survey they did that was just recently concluded estimates that our global capacity right now, by the end of 2021, will be 2 to 4 billion doses of this vaccine. And that is pretty good, right? It could be better, and I think a lot of these companies are trying to improve. And there are different estimates. This is only one, and it's based off a limited survey, which is limited by the number of participants and the vaccine manufacturers who responded, but 2 to 4 billion is not terrible. And that's pretty good. And that is considering still that we have many other vaccines that we still need to produce, right? Because all these other illnesses, right? Malaria, not malaria, we don't have vaccine. Meningitis, polio, all these different illnesses don't disappear because of an epidemic. And so 2 to 4 billion is enormous, right? And the manufacturing capacities are just increasing as we go along because these companies realize how important this vaccine will be. So we look around the world and we know that the vaccine will need to travel across borders and across countries the same way that the coronavirus has. We know that the vaccine has to accompany the number of infections and the vulnerability that each country possesses, right? Currently, as it stands, the countries with the largest number of infections are unsurprisingly the United States, Brazil, India, and Russia, although other large countries are following suit. So it's important that when we do have a vaccine, it's readily accessible, not just in the United States or China, but across the world so that it can get into the hands, or rather get into the arms of those who need it. The takeaway of this presentation is to have your chin up. There are plenty of smart people with skin in the game focusing on finding a cure, or in this case, rather, a preventative method. So they're focusing on developing that vaccine, right? What you can do, of course, is continue to learn, educate yourself on this, make sure that you're social distancing. I know that it's tempting I know many of us have relaxed our expectations of social distancing, but just because the numbers in New Jersey, Connecticut, New York, the tri-state area, some other places in the United States are lowering, it's important to still maintain social distancing practices. And it's also important to consider how others around you will be affected by the coronavirus should they be infected. And you don't want to be the person that gives it to them, which I know many of you know, but as just a reminder, keep your distance. I know that you want to give your friends hugs and you want to give them high fives and whatever teens do with one another. But it's important. This is a collective effort. As you've seen from the vaccine presentation, this is a collective effort on the vaccine front, and it must be a collective effort on in our hands as well as we await that vaccine. If you have any questions about vaccine manufacturing, equity in the vaccine distribution process, the vaccine development pipeline, whatever it might be, I'm not an expert, but I can always lend an ear and give you some words of very much partial and optimistic wisdom. And of course, my email is always there too. My email is not hemispheres@yale.org, but if you email hemispheres@yale.org, they can put you in contact with me. And I'd be happy to help out in any way I can. College essays, college advice, talking about AP classes, IB classes, whatever it might be, I'm there for you. Thank you all so much, and it was a pleasure being a teacher for Hemispheres.